Welcome back to the Dr. Doug Show. Today I have an interview that I'm really excited about. Today I interview Lily Nichols. She is a registered dietitian as well as several other things that I'll tell you about in a second. But this is a really important interview because it gets into bone health factors in a totally different audience. So if you are a younger audience, specifically younger adult, Lily's specialty is in the perinatal years around women who are trying to get pregnant, having difficulties with pregnancy, postpartum, etc. She is steeped in knowledge around nutrition, around supplements, around hormone health, and because of the things that happen in this time frame, also around bone health. So this is a really fun conversation because she and I get into some of the areas where her unique population and my unique population of the traditional osteoporosis age group really overlap. And I think it's a really fun conversation. And if you are in this younger group, or you're concerned about bone health, or you think you may need to be concerned about bone health, or you know somebody that's in this group that should be concerned about bone health, please pass this along to them because Lily speaks to this very, very eloquently. A little bit more about her background in case you want to know. Lily, like I said, is a registered dietitian. She's a nutritionist. She's a certified diabetes educator. She is a researcher, and she has written a couple of books that are very well read and have really amazing information in them. So stick around for this. We're going to go through some of the really fun topics around bone health from her perspective with the research that she's done. And I think you're going to really like how this syncs up with our overall message around how to optimize bone health, even as a young adult, a young woman in these really important years. All right. So Lily Nichols, thank you so much for joining me on the Dr. Doug Show. I'm excited to bring a different spin to some of these topics around bone health, specific to the audience that you're used to talking to and to writing for. So again, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. So you are, I would say, kind of an unlikely candidate to be interviewed for this podcast. But the reason why we wanted to bring you on is that part of our mission is to educate women and men, really of all ages, about the importance of bone loss and bone health. And you've written on bone health in your books. And so can you give us a little background about where you consider your expertise to be, the things that you like to write and talk about, and how that then blends into the bone health conversation?
Sure thing. So yeah, my specialty is actually in the nutrition side of things. I'm a registered dietitian, and I have books encompassing the perinatal space, so fertility, pregnancy, pregnancy complications. And really what I write about is sort of the gap between what our conventional guidelines suggest being optimal and where there's data suggesting we can actually do better. And I really promote a more real food ancestral approach to nutrition. So the way that this weaves into the bone health conversation is that if we want to go all the way back to not just thinking about us living right now, but the future generation, we're like building a brand new skeleton in utero. So that is a consideration, thinking about mom's bone health and babies. A lot of times when women are undernourished, not only is there issues with their baby's skeletal development, but it can also affect mom's bone health. I don't know if you've heard about like lactational osteoporosis or osteopenia. That can definitely happen when they get too depleted in certain minerals and vitamins and other compounds. And then in the fertility space, oftentimes we see bone issues showing up at actually younger ages in women if they're underfueling. And when they're underfueling and their hormone production is lower, and they're also catabolizing their tissues for energy production, you start catabolizing bone tissue as well. And we see osteoporosis showing up oftentimes in younger female athletes. Yeah. So it really becomes worrisome when that's happening at an early age, because we're really building our peak bone mass at those younger ages.
Yeah, and we certainly see that. You know, we have patients in their 20s and 30s, and many of them are young female athletes, and some young male athletes for that matter. But yeah, young female athletes we definitely see. And then I don't have any current patients, but I get a lot of questions from women that are diagnosed in that sort of like perinatal time frame. You know, and it could be after multiple pregnancies, issues with lactation, whatever. So yeah, I definitely think this is something that I would love to bring awareness to. So let's just back up a little bit and talk about like the burden of, you know, carrying a child, creating that skeleton in utero. Like you said, I've never thought of it like that. You know, so you're asking a whole lot of the body. So from a nutritional perspective, how can we support this this population of women who are going through the process of carrying a child, creating a skeleton in utero, and protecting their own at the same time? What are your principles here?
Yeah, so a big consideration for me, it would be consuming enough food. You need adequate calories to support adequate hormone production, and your hormone production is at an all-time high in pregnancy. And then specifically looking at dietary factors that can play a role in this. I find a lot of women are actually under consuming protein. I don't think we give protein enough of an acknowledgement for its role in supporting bone health. And in fact, there's all sorts of myths we can get into later on protein and bone health, and people have opinions that high protein is going to create bone issues or leach minerals out of the body. That's not true. But in pregnancy specifically, your protein needs are substantially higher than they are outside of pregnancy. And this goes far beyond what our guidelines suggest. Our guidelines suggest like a teeny little bump in protein intake is plenty, but we have some newer research. It's not that new. 2015 was the first ever study that looked at protein requirements in pregnant women, and they found that they underestimated true protein requirements by about 73%. So we need a lot more protein, especially in late pregnancy. As some of that protein, you'd want to be getting some collagen sources of protein as well, which support bone health, as well as your, ligaments and tendons. And there's just massive collagen turnover in the body in pregnancy with growing the baby and just its whole skeletal system, tendons, organs, whatnot, the changes in the vascular system, the stretching of maternal skin, etc. So protein plus high collagen protein foods. I'd be thinking about minerals, calcium, magnesium being some of the bigger ones, some of the littler ones like silica you could also speak to, and your fat-soluble vitamins, especially vitamins D and vitamin K2 for building stronger bones. And there's been some smaller studies that have looked at maternal osteoporosis that is occurring during pregnancy, and treating that with vitamin K2, which helps direct the calcium into your bones rather than the calcium getting deposited into soft tissues and other places where we don't want it. And we're in a place where like vitamin K2 is known that, maybe in your circle, people know about vitamin K2, but it's not like a popular one.
Right.
Back when I was in college, I took this vitamins metabolism class and was like, I'm going to do my, big end of year presentation on vitamin K2. And there was like no research on vitamin K2, just like none. Now there's like a little bit more. But to give your audience an idea of where you get vitamin K2 outside of supplementation, you find it in primarily animal foods. Fermented dairy products has to be full fat. That's where the vitamin K2 is found. And they're not fortifying it back in when they take out the fat, like they do with the other vitamin A and vitamin D. And then also this very specialty ultra fermented soy product called natto, which is really only popularly consumed in Japan and certain parts of Asia. So really, when you have people who aren't consuming animal foods, a lot of times they're just not getting K2. Vitamin D being so crucial. This is another one where the guidelines have really gotten it wrong. If you look back at some of the vitamin D research, people will call out that there was a statistical error made when they were estimating vitamin D requirements for the population, where they probably underestimated it by about a factor of 10. So, we have, I'm sure you probably agree, but we have so much data amassed on the benefits of vitamin D supplementation in pregnancy. If you have women just hitting the RDA, they're becoming more and more deficient in vitamin D over the course of their pregnancy. So we have like high quality data on supplementation, randomized controlled trials, supplementing with 4,000 IUs per day compared to the 600 IUs that's in the guidelines, improving maternal vitamin D status, but also critically improving baby's vitamin D status as well, and reducing the risk of infant rickets. We have a explosion of cases of infant rickets nowadays because of maternal vitamin D deficiency during pregnancy. We also have an epidemic of dental enamel hypoplasia, where there's dental enamel defects, which start in utero and the teeth are being formed. And they've actually shown that maternal supplementation with vitamin D can reduce the chances of that happening by over 50%. So we need to get the fat-soluble vitamins and the minerals in to prevent these issues from happening.
That's awesome. Well, I'm going to hit on some supplementation stuff. So I'm just making a couple notes about that. I want to let's really dig into some of the nutrition stuff, because you said some really important points that I don't want to just gloss over. And I love what you said about K2. So I'm going to come back to D and K2 later, because I think you just nailed something for me that I've been looking for, which is that osteoporosis seems like one of the few areas where there is such a strong need across the board for D supplementation. But I think you just showed me another one. So thank you for that. So, but let's talk a little bit more about whole food nutrition, because I feel like we're on the same page here, which is as many nutrients through whole foods as possible is better. And then supplementation for the things that you're unlikely to be getting, like K2 is a great example. So when you talk to your audience about what those whole food sources should be, the biggest area that I run into is around protein. Like you said, we don't talk enough about protein. So much conversation around dietary fat, keto, carbs, no carbs, great, these carbs, those carbs, whatever. But really, for me, when people say, tell me one thing about nutrition for bone health, I say, get adequate protein, preferably from animal sources, period. And I get a lot of kickback, as you can imagine. I'm sure you do too, from people that are what I want to talk about next, which is in the alkaline theory around diet and bone health, which you mentioned briefly. But just give me your reasoning behind animal products as the source of protein when it comes to getting optimal protein for the audience that you're talking about.
Yes, I've written quite extensively on this because I get a lot of questions on this as well. So protein, I am in agreement with you in that protein to me, of our three macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbohydrates, protein to me is the one most critical that people get enough of. If you just zero in on protein, get enough protein, a lot of these other dietary issues become non-issues. As well as metabolic health issues and probably bone health issues as well. Those also probably improve, I'm going to guess. Yep. But the key with protein is that there's different protein quality. Our protein is made of individual amino acids that are all, strung together in different organizations to create these, what our body uses to create proteins. And so if we are not getting enough of an array of amino acids, we end up with bottlenecks metabolically in our body to create bodily proteins and enzymes and other things that helps our system function correctly. And this will be an interesting one. I don't know if you've heard this, but we have in nutrition land, dietetics world, I was taught that there's essential amino acids and there's non-essential amino acids. The essential ones you have to consume from your diet, the non-essential ones you don't have to consume. You can make enough of them from all the other amino acids, so don't worry about them. And this has long been a big talking point in the vegetarian or vegan community, because all they need to do is just combine different vegetarian protein sources and they're fine. They'll have a complete protein. That's fine. So it turns out that it has never scientifically been proven that there is such a thing as a non-essential amino acid. Okay. And we have growing evidence in the way in which protein research has changed over the years. We can now measure the metabolism of individual amino acids and see how our body is using it and how quickly we're burning it up and how much we actually need. And we have all sorts of research into these so-called non-essential amino acids and how they're actually really vital for the human body. And the key here is that while yes, with plant foods, you can get enough of the 9 essential amino acids by combining beans and rice and things like that, you're not going to get certain so-called non-essential amino acids because they are not present in plant foods, or they are not present in sufficient quantities in plant foods to meet our needs. So we see this for many examples of this. We see creatine, taurine, carnitine, glycine, carnosine. There's so many different examples of these amino acids that are really crucial to our overall health. Taurine is a huge one that I'll point out. Have you read anything about
Yeah.
taurine? Does that
So
ring
it's
a
funny.
bell?
We go back and forth on taurine a lot in our provider meetings. One of our providers just loves taurine, so it ends up coming up over and over again. But yeah, please
Okay,
go ahead.
cool. So taurine is really vital in the pregnancy space for bone development. And when you're low in taurine, you have issues with bone development. And the idea is, oh, well, your body could just make enough taurine for other amino acids. Okay, it can make some. We have an endogenous system to make some, but you know what the cofactor is for taurine synthesis?
I don't.
Vitamin B12.
Oh, of course.
So who's not consuming the vitamin B12? Well, the people who are not consuming the animal products, right? So if you just consumed the animal products, you'd get enough taurine. You'd also get, enough B12, and this issue would be a non-issue. But we start to open up this whole can of worms with potential nutrient deficiencies, and sometimes even in these little nutrients that most dietitians even have never heard of, that could play a role in ultimately bone health down the line. So yeah, maybe that's a long way of
Yeah,
answering your
no,
question,
no,
but
no. It's really great, and so I've talked about this in a lot of different ways because I do think it's so important because so many people do come into our program with osteoporosis eating an exclusively plant diet, and so we have to look at this from various different ways to help them to understand the importance. Or okay, if you want to stay that way, that's your choice, and I support that. But here are all the things that we're going to need to supplement in order for you to do that, and then it becomes really overwhelming. So it's just a really good way of looking at it. I also have you looked at the literature on the absorption capacity or the ability of us to, as humans, to absorb the amino acids from plants versus animals? Has that been part of your research?
yes, definitely. Yeah, so I kind of got into a little, I don't know, side thing on protein, but yeah, so there's the idea of protein quality, which refers to like the balance of amino acids, the digestibility of the protein to release the amino acids for absorption, and then also the availability of the absorbed amino acids for protein synthesis. And we see all of this is lower in plant proteins. So even if you're consuming like a higher amount or sufficient, so-called sufficient protein, as a vegetarian, your ability to utilize those amino acids is lower. And there's actually a really interesting paper I came across when I was writing Real Food for Fertility that was looking at, should we set a separate RDA for protein for vegetarians? So already, I'm sure we both agree the RDA for protein is set far too low.
Way
Far
too low.
too low. Far too low for bone health too, by the way. So even assuming that the RDA is good, they found that vegetarians actually probably need about 20% more total protein to be able to have sufficient available amino acids for protein synthesis.
Well, that'll
And
be. Go ahead.
like,
Finish.
well, just one little
Yeah,
thing.
go ahead. Finish.
When they set the RDA, the reason they didn't set a separate one for vegetarians is they assumed that 50% of protein that vegetarians consumed would be coming from animal sources like eggs and dairy products. That's
Mm,
not the case with
no.
vegetarians these days. That might have been the case in the 80s and 90s, but we're at a time where even people who don't consider themselves vegetarians are eating so heavily plant-based that they're
Right.
probably not even getting 50% of their protein intake from animal sources. So they'd
Right.
probably also need to get 20% more protein even than, an average omnivore.
Yeah, and I do laugh when people say I eat a plant-based diet. I'm like, well, the standard American diet's a plant-based diet, so that's not a step in the right direction. And so, yeah, actually, what you just said, that 20% will be very well received by our mostly plant-based audience because I usually say 60% more, so they'll be happy to hear 20% instead of 60%. Do you have a baseline that you recommend across the board for people? Like, I know we're not making specific recommendations for any one person, but so for example, I use 1 gram per pound as like a reasonable starting point, or 2.2 per kilogram. Do you have something that you recommend for your population? Is it similar to that?
It's pretty similar to that. I mean, I think sometimes you have to factor in lean body mass, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if you have somebody with a higher BMI, you might need to, like, choose a more reasonable
Dial
goal.
it
Otherwise, you
back.
have
Yeah. Yeah.
otherwise you have people like with recommendations of like 300 grams of protein a day or something, which
Right. Well, and
yeah.
I didn't say that right. It should be per ideal body weight. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. So, no, I think that's a good starting point. I think when you have people, especially who are more active, they do need to focus on protein a lot more. Their protein turnover is a lot higher. Female athletes need a lot more. Male athletes too. So, yeah, I think we're
Yeah.
in agreement on that.
Yeah. That's great. And what's crazy is that the RDA, like you said, at 0.8 per kilogram is, I don't even know what the percentage is. It's way less than 50% of that. Right.
Yeah.
And it's so low. And then we see people who are looking at that and saying, oh, I don't even know if we need to hit that. And people that are on specifically a vegan diet who are getting no animal protein whatsoever. And so, yeah, we see them in our patient population with osteoporosis.
Right.
So the next thing I'd love to dig into, and I'm so glad that you brought it up because this is such an important point. I'm actually recording a video on this later, another video on this idea of higher quote unquote acid forming foods resulting in leaching of calcium from the bones, increased urinary calcium excretion. I'll give you the context for this, which is I'm recording a video on this diet called the Scarsborough diet. And there was a publication on this, pretty small, so I would be surprised if you'd heard of it. But the whole principle was all just the normal alkaline diet stuff, where they were saying alkaline diet will get better and will, it will give people these vegetables, which are going to reduce the urinary acid load or the renal acid load, and then it's going to reduce urinary calcium excretion. And so then they measured bone turnover markers, and they talked about DEXA, but didn't actually measure it. And then they have their results. I'm not going to give those away. But you mentioned earlier about calcium excretion and removing calcium from bones because of certain foods. Can you give us your perspective on that? I think we're probably well in alignment here, but I'd love to hear how you've researched it because I don't hear this very often.
Yeah, so I've looked at it from the angle of I think the concern is that it could be harming kidney function. People get really concerned about high protein and kidney function.
Yeah.
And now we do have quite a bit of data on this that have kind of overturned previously widely held beliefs on this. So when it comes to bone health, it turns out that protein intake actually promotes better bone health and increases calcium absorption. So it's the opposite of what we were told for many years. There's actually some data for among women in their 50s, those who had the highest average protein intake in the previous 20 years or more, averaging about 90 plus grams of protein per day, they actually had the lowest odds of falls, fractures, the greatest grip strength, fastest walking speed. So those who are getting more protein are actually faring better. I think the whole concept of the excess, losing calcium out of your bones has been, I think, debunked, I guess, with some of the current research showing that regardless of what's going on with urinary excretion of anything, we see better bone health among people who are eating more protein, specifically more animal protein, by the way, because you could see the opposite with high soy protein consumers.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit about soy to that extent too? Because I get so many comments when I talk about complete proteins and all the essential amino acids. And of course, the comeback is, well, I eat a lot of soy, which is technically a complete protein. But we see some funny stuff in the literature with high soy consumption. So what have you seen with that?
So there's just a ton of issues with soy. I'll just go into some of the general things and then like a couple things on bone health more specifically. So soy is really high in something called phytic acid, which is a compound that acts almost like a claw and like grabs onto and chelates minerals, holds onto minerals so your body cannot absorb them. And that includes calcium, magnesium, two biggies for bone health, as well as some other minerals. It also has some compounds called goitrogens that block the absorption of iodine, so that can impact thyroid hormones. It's kind of debatable how much that impacts an average person's thyroid function, but for people whose thyroid function is already sluggish, soy usually is not helping the cause here. And of course, thyroid function can have some impact on bone health too. We also see that soy sometimes is contaminated with certain heavy metals. This can depend on how it's grown or how it's processed. aluminum and cadmium being one of them, or two of them rather. Both of those can impact bone health to some degree. And then just the way in which we are like processing our soy products these days, it's not traditionally processed in the way in which it would have been, long fermented into soy sauce or miso or something traditionally. But also, Americans are consuming a lot more soy than even is traditionally consumed in Asia. And I think this is an important point. So I actually pulled up the data on this when I was writing about soy recently, where they looked at soy intake in China, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and they found that total soy protein intake per day averaged only 6 to 11 grams per day. Okay, you think about soy protein intake among Americans, especially those eating a more modern, plant-based diet or vegan diet. I mean, you could get a soy protein bar that has like 20 grams of soy protein in a single protein bar. And then you're having like the fake meat crumbles at your dinner, and you're having, the soy protein in your shake in the morning. People are just getting a lot more soy than they think when they're trying to eat by that, by those certain principles. And when there was an analysis on vegan diets, and the primary contribution to calories among vegans in the US was carbohydrates and soy. Those were the two sources that explained the highest amount of calories consumed in that group.
Yeah. It's really interesting. In this video I'm recording later on this Scarsborough diet topic, they actually break down macronutrients that these people were consuming for 3 months. Of course, it was off of a 3-day food questionnaire, so whatever that's worth. But yeah, it was, I forget what the number is, like a 60 or 70% carbohydrate diet, right? And it's like,
yes,
that's a lot of carbohydrates, even for an average person. Let's go back to the supplementation thing, because you said some really important points around D-supplementation and K2. So just a little context for us, we are big advocates for D-supplementation in the osteoporosis community, because we are trying to optimize this calcium system. We're trying to get the minerals into bone, and we need vitamin D to do that. So even if we're not truly deficient, I'm not afraid to give some, because I think there's a big range as far as how high we can go and not cause negatives. K2, though, this is a population where everybody who has osteoporosis who's on YouTube knows about K2, which is cool, because it's penetrated this population. And there is probably not a lot more research now than when you did your initial research a long time ago, but there is some. And so we do dig into K2, but here's a question about K2, because this is what I run into. So there's different forms of K2, K1. There's all this fear around blood clotting, which I mentioned to you earlier. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, so I was trained to use the drug Coumadin, and we talked about vitamin K, and we're like, oh my gosh, don't eat spinach, because you're going to change your blood clotting factors. Now in our modern era, where most people aren't on that drug, what did your research show you around vitamin K? Do we need all 3 of the Ks? Do we just need K2? Do we need to worry about blood clots? Can you help me out there?
A long time ago, I actually had a friend who had a weird blood clot issue, and she was asking me about K2. So I actually dug into this. K2 actually does not have a dramatic impact on blood clotting, unlike K1, which does definitely impact blood clotting. So K2 is mostly affecting your calcium metabolism, calcium utilization. So I don't think you need to worry about the clotting issue with K2 specifically. And I mean, I don't know, just thinking about this a little off the cuff, but our richest source of vitamin K2 is that super fermented soy product, natto. And think of the enzyme that they get from natto kinase, they literally use for dissolving blood clots. So,
that's right.
Just going to throw that out there. Whether or not that has any useful relation to what we're talking about is a separate thing. But as for the different forms, you said 3 different forms. Are you talking about like MK7 and MK4?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, I haven't found like a clear answer to this in the research. There's been one major supplement, like ingredient manufacturer, I could say, did a lot of the early research on K2, and they were specifically using the natto derived form, which is only
which is
MK7.
MK7. Yeah. Exactly.
MK4 you get in animal foods. They both seem to have beneficial biological activity. Whether you need both of them, I'm not entirely sure on. I used to be of the opinion that MK7 was superior, and then started to dig in more specifically to the studies and was like, oh, this was funded by, yeah.
Yeah.
So my opinion is I think they're both fine, but really what you're going to get for most people's diets, you're probably going to be getting MK4 and not very much MK7.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey with us with vitamin K, and so we have products that have both MK4 and MK7. I don't really worry about K1 either. Like I don't think we need to supplement that for bone. I think the K2 is really where
Correct.
the action is there. And then the biggest difference that I've found is that MK4 just has a shorter half life. And so if we're
Yes.
supplementing it, I think MK7 makes more sense because we're going to have to dose it less frequently. But there's a lot of research that needs to be done in the vitamin K space as far as optimal dosing and, can we actually reverse, calcification in arteries, et cetera. We see
Right.
some cool early stuff with that, but I think there's a lot of unanswered questions there. So
And they
then,
don't even have an RDA for vitamin K2, by the way. So like it's not even considered an essential nutrient by our current standards. So
yeah,
I expect that probably to shift in the next 10 years, but we will see. I'm not holding my breath.
it's slow. It's really slow.
Yeah.
So then what other supplements outside of D and K2 or did you do research on that you think would be helpful for a young population who's concerned about bone health?
I would definitely throw magnesium into the
Hmm.
mix. So, magnesium and calcium are kind of partners in crime, so to speak. But also from the standpoint of vitamin D, there's a number of different enzymatic reactions involved in vitamin D metabolism. And the vast majority of those, some people say all, I'm not sure if all is technically true, but vast majority of them require magnesium as a cofactor.
Yeah.
So sometimes people who perform poorly on vitamin D supplementation, they get some, funky side effects, or their vitamin D blood levels or 25 hydroxy D levels are not going up despite high dose supplementation. Sometimes you can correct that with magnesium supplementation as well. And magnesium is
Hmm.
something that is just so underconsumed across the board. It is something that's really tricky to get enough of from your diet alone. I'm really on the magnesium supplementation camp for the vast majority of people.
Yeah. What's your favorite form to supplement?
I mean, it depends. So a lot of time I'm working with, the pregnant and fertile population. I like magnesium glycinate a lot because glycine is an amino acid that is helpful in these life stages. It's also kind of calming. It's good right before bed. It's absorbed well. It doesn't tend to cause GI effects, unlike
Yeah.
some other forms of magnesium. I also like magnesium malate. And then you can get into all the like interesting ones. They can chelate magnesium to taurine, and that has some specific effects. If you need to kind of like increase GI motility a little bit, you have somebody
Hmm.
struggling with constipation, you could do a magnesium citrate, which kind of increases transit time a little bit, but isn't so harsh in the digestion like a magnesium oxide is like osmotic laxative. Like I do not
Right.
recommend.
Hmm.
Citrate can kind of give you like a little help from the motility department, but I'm typically choosing one of the amino acid chelated magnesium supplements for their better absorption.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a great rundown of the different mags. Yeah. So mag's a big part of what we do too. Any others that you think are critical to hit on?
From a bone health perspective,
Yeah, sure.
or just as a whole. I mean, I think for a lot of people who are just, it is what it is. Diet quality in the US is not great. Like 58% of calories on a typical American diet come from ultra processed foods, which
Yeah.
are just devoid of nutrients. So
Right.
I am a fan for most individuals, if they don't really have their food dialed in, to have a multivitamin. Some
Hmm.
of these multivitamins also include some of the minerals in there as well, probably not as much as what you would need for, really combating osteoporosis or osteopenia, but nonetheless, that can sometimes hit on a lot of different things
Yeah.
in one place. And then I'm often considering certain supplementation for like what is going on with the individual. Like, is their gut health compromised? Okay, we might need to look in that arena. Maybe they have like a long-term history of use of antibiotics, and we might want to, correct with some probiotic supplementation, really focusing on prebiotic foods for them. Maybe you have a long-term vegetarian who's like stomach acid production and enzyme production is really compromised, and they might need some betaine HCl and some digestive enzymes to help like get the digestive fire going again so they can digest their foods.
Yeah.
Might have somebody with like some metabolic health issues that we want to be targeting. I might consider supplemental carnitine for boosting like fatty acid oxidation, or creatine supplementation for muscle strength and metabolic health, inositol for blood sugar metabolism, for hormone balance. So it kind of just depends. I'm really kind of tailoring it to what the individual might need.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. We kind of do the same thing. We have like a core 3 or 4, and then from there, it's got to all be custom because everybody's needs are different from that point. Man, awesome. Well, I've got a whole host of other things that we could talk about, but like I said when we started, I try to keep these bite-sized, and I think this was a great conversation around bone health and nutrition. It's going to hit multiple audiences from a different age group. So I really appreciate you sharing with me the research that you've done, because you're in a different group than I am. You're looking at a different population, and yet we see these similarities where the power of nutrition, the power of whole food nutrients is really required in order to optimize bone health, really across the entire spectrum of life from in utero on out. So I think let's stop there. And thank you so much for joining us. Any last comments about your work and things you think that people should know about bone health, and particularly in the perinatal timeframe?
Gosh, I will just say, like, do your best to hit those protein goals. It makes a really big difference. If you have any, like, it sounds like you have a big patient population or audience who's on some form of a plant-based diet, or maybe recovering from such. I do write really extensively about like hitting on all the individual vitamins, minerals, amino acids, macronutrient balance, hormone concerns with a vegetarian diet, in chapter 5 of Real Food for Fertility. So if anybody wants to dig into that, I really highly recommend reading that chapter. I just find that this topic gets very like emotional, and people don't objectively like look at the data. And as a former vegetarian and friends to many currently practicing vegetarians and vegans, I really try to take it just from a data standpoint, non-emotional, non all of the various reasons that people get into it, but just like, okay, let's really look at what's at stake here. And like you said, what we're eating in our formative years, all the way through to the perimenopausal transition, that really is setting up our bone health for the rest of our lives. So I hear it all the time from female athletes who wish that they would have fueled more earlier, because now they're in their 40s with osteopenia, and we can really prevent a lot of this with better nutrition.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's what's funny is it's not funny, it's really sad, but I see the really excelling athletes, like the really good athletes in their 20s and 30s are the ones that have the worst issues early on. So like our patients in their 20s and 30s, usually long distance runners, were elite level, winning races nationally and internationally. And so it's almost like the better you are, the worse you are. And so what I would love to say, if this is a younger audience than we typically have watching this video or listening to this podcast, is it really pays to know, if you're in this group, what your bone mineral density is. So getting an early DEXA or REMS, which is a non-radiation ultrasound version, Echo Light REMS, cool way to do it for younger individuals worried about radiation. But you can get a sense of what your bone density is so that you know what your starting point is. You know how hard you need to work on this.
And just if I can point out one little more thing about this group, since we kind of got into the athletes and the hypothalamic amenorrhea group, the nutrition recommendations for these athletes is terrible. Like, really what they are usually told is to increase their carb intake. That's it. They're just eat more calories, eat more carbs. And because there's a possibility that there's maybe some disordered eating tendencies here, eat more processed foods, because we have to get rid of any, fears around anything being
Right.
unhealthy. We just want to have you eat more calories, period, specifically more carbs because you're an athlete. But they don't focus on eating enough fat for hormone production. They don't focus on eating more protein that these athletes truly need for not only their hormones and getting their cycle back, but their bones as well. So it's a missed opportunity here.
Yeah.
So yeah, anyone who's an athlete listening to this, then also read the hypothalamic amenorrhea chapter of Real Food for Fertility, because we kind of set the record straight on, calling out where we get it wrong nutritionally, because we're doing a lot of athletes a disservice. Like, I
Yeah.
recently heard from a woman in her early 20s. She's a collegiate athlete, primary amenorrhea, had never had a period. Okay.
Yeah.
She had tried all the things. She even tried reducing her activity levels, and she actually got her cycle back. She got her cycle back within 2 months of reading Real Food for Fertility. I didn't even know something like that was possible, right? Or got her cycle for the first time, I should say. She had never
Right.
even had a
Right.
period. Primary
Yeah.
amenorrhea, never had a period. And it was specifically because she focused more on eating more fat and protein. She's like, I was
Yep.
eating all the carbs, I was eating enough calories, but calories doesn't always equate to nourishment. So
Yeah.
we gotta take it a step deeper with the athlete nutrition, and that will hopefully help her out with her bone health when she's at the age where you're seeing people, so
Yeah.
we'll see.
Well, yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because I have a patient that I'm thinking of, same thing, never had a period. And then just about, I don't know, 3 months into our program, listening to the recommendations, she started cycling.
Wow.
And it's irregular, but it's, when I look at her, what she's eating, she just falls back into her old patterns. And we'll see her protein drop, we'll see her fat drop, and then her cycle goes away.
Yep.
And we're like, you're under fueling or
Yep.
overrunning or both. So
Exactly. It's usually a combination.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, again, thanks for bringing up all that stuff, and thanks for your time. Really appreciate you bringing this topic to our audience.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Lily Nichols. I think we did a really important job of putting together the nutrition side, the alkaline diet theory, all of the things that go along with the misconceptions around bone health that really start younger in our adult years. So I'm really thankful for her work in this space. I'm really grateful we could have her on the show. If you're still struggling to put together your own bone health program, please consider coming to our free masterclass. Link for that in the description below on YouTube. And if you've already been to the masterclass and you're looking for a support group, please consider our HealthSpan Nation. HealthSpan Nation is our community, not necessarily patients, but our patients are in there too, but our community of individuals who are really doing it on their own, but looking for some additional support from the community, ability to ask questions, support from our team through a non-medical Zoom, just general information Zoom that we do once a week on specific topics, and have lots of time for Q&A. We also have a content library, and we have a bunch of other discount codes on services and products that we have vetted and offer to our patients as well. So the HSN community is awesome. Again, link for that in the description on YouTube, or go to our website, optimalhumanhealth.com. I'll see you on the next video.